guy burst into the garage, but it was already too late. The HOA was already inside and had run into my Rottweiler. A low, menacing growl echoed in the darkness. Linda screamed, and Barkley froze, pressing himself against the wall. Titan took a step forward. Barkley swallowed hard and whispered, "Oh God, not this." But what happened next became their worst nightmare. But let's start from the beginning. The rich aroma of coffee filled my living room as I leaned back in my chair, scrolling through the news feed on my phone. The morning was surprisingly quiet, and deep down I hoped, just for today, that the HOA would leave me alone. These guys always found a reason to bother me. One day, the grass was too long. The next, my trash bin was the wrong shade of gray. I had long since realized they were just looking for ways to squeeze more money out of me. But I was stubborn, and I wasn't about to cave to their absurd demands. Taking another sip of coffee, I glanced toward the window. That's when I heard it. Voices outside, muffled but persistent, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal clanking. I frowned. Someone was on my property. Slowly placing my mug on the table, I stood up and walked over to the window, pulling the blinds open just enough to see. What I saw made my blood boil. A tow truck sat in my driveway, its massive steel frame gleaming under the morning sun. The driver was fiddling with the winch mechanism. But that wasn't the worst part. Standing right next to him were two all too familiar faces, two people whose mere presence made me want to curse out loud. Jeffrey Barkley and Linda Hale, the head of the HOA and his right-hand enforcer. Barkley looked like he had just stepped out of a luxury real estate commercial. Perfectly pressed suit, slicked back hair, and that ever-present smug expression that screamed, "I own everything in this neighborhood, including you." Linda, on the other hand, was exactly as I remembered. Short, bob-cut hair, thin lips pressed into a permanent scowl, and arms crossed so tightly over her chest that she looked ready to start listing violations even on her deathbed. Her entire stance said, "I'm here for a reason, and you're going to regret seeing me." I watched as they whispered to each other, stealing glances at my garage, like they were plotting their next move. I hadn't received any official notices, no letters, no calls, no warnings, and yet there they were, acting like my property was theirs to take, like my car was already gone. My fists clenched. What the hell? Rage built up inside me with every passing second. I was about to storm outside and tell these two exactly how wrong they were when something happened that sent ice through my veins. I heard the garage door creak open. They weren't just standing outside, they were already inside. For a second, I stood frozen in disbelief. They had just trespassed into my garage. The anger burning inside me turned to something colder, sharper. They hadn't knocked. They hadn't called. They hadn't even pretended to ask for permission. They had simply walked onto my property and broken in, as if it were their right. Adrenaline surged up my spine. 1,000 thoughts flashed through my mind. Call the police? Raise hell? But before I could decide, one crucial thought hit me. They had no idea what was waiting for them inside. I turned and bolted toward the garage, barely suppressing the vicious grin tugging at my lips. They had just made their biggest mistake. I sprinted toward the garage, but it was already too late. The doors were open. The intruders had stepped inside. Silence hung in the air for a moment, but not for long. A low, menacing growl shattered the stillness. Titan, my Rottweiler. 120 pounds of pure muscle, razor-sharp reflexes, and an instinct to protect. He had been peacefully asleep in the corner of the garage, undisturbed, until unfamiliar footsteps and foreign scents invaded his space. Now he was awake. A shriek pierced the air, sharp, panicked. "Jeffrey! He has a dog!" Linda screeched. Her voice was trembling, and from the sound of it, she had already started stumbling backward, slamming into something behind her. I reached the doorway and cracked it open just enough to get a clear view inside. The sight was glorious. Titan stood in the middle of the garage, his massive frame tensed, the fur on his back bristling. His jaws were tight, lips curled just enough to expose gleaming teeth. His eyes, dark, cold, and utterly devoid of friendliness, were locked onto Barkley and Linda. Barkley, the same smug bastard who had acted like a king just minutes ago, was now frozen in place, too scared to even breathe. Nice doggy," he stammered, stepping back ever so slowly. Titan immediately stepped forward, closing the distance. Barkley stopped moving. Linda shrieked again, desperately grabbing onto his arm. "What is that monster?" Titan bared his teeth wider, letting out a sound that wasn't just a growl. It was thunder. 1 second, 2, 3. Titan stood perfectly still, never breaking eye contact with the trespassers. The silence was suffocating. Barkley swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as he tried to force words out. But then, his heel caught on an old cardboard box. He crashed onto his back, arms flailing. Linda gasped, clutching her head as she recoiled toward the wall. Titan moved, slowly, deliberately, 2 feet. Now, his snout was level with Barkley's face. Even from the doorway, I could hear the trembling breaths of the man who just moments ago had been so sure of himself. Barkley's hands were shaking. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. "Looking for something?" I asked, crossing my arms. Linda turned stiffly, her face drained of color. Her finger trembled as she pointed at Titan. "Make him stop!" she shrieked. I smiled. "Oh, now you have a problem? Funny, just a minute ago you seemed perfectly fine walking into my garage without permission." Titan didn't move. Barkley, still sprawled on the floor, was shaking as he held up a folder of papers like a shield. "We're acting under HOA regulations. Your car violates the community guidelines, and we have the authority to confiscate it." I laughed. "Right. So you thought the best way to handle that was to break into my property? That, my friend, is called trespassing." Titan lowered his head slightly, bringing his gleaming teeth even closer to Barkley's face. Barkley trembled. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he choked out the words, "Oh God, not this." Linda broke first. The arrogance drained from her face in an instant. Letting out a shriek like a cornered animal, she bolted for the exit, shoving past anything in her way. "I'm not getting paid for this, Jeffrey!" she screamed, flailing her arms as she leaped over boxes like she was on fire. She exploded out of the garage, practically kicking the front door open behind her without a single glance back. Barkley stayed. Still on the floor, he desperately tried to crawl backward, but kept bumping into shelves, tool racks, and storage bins. His hands trembled, his eyes darting wildly around the garage, searching for an escape. There was none. I stepped forward slowly, leaning down, pinning him under an icy stare. "Until you sign a confession admitting to trespassing and attempted theft, my dog stays right where he is." Barkley froze. His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his face turning ashen. His fingers clutched his tie, as if the fabric could somehow shield him. You're joking, right?" His voice quivered with fear, but he still tried to hold on to whatever shred of authority he had left. I pulled out my phone and pressed record. "Admit you broke into my garage without permission, and you walk out of here in one piece." I let the words hang in the air before slowly turning my head toward Titan. The Rottweiler understood the signal. He took a step forward, slow, heavy, deliberate. Each paw against the concrete floor echoed through the garage like the fall of a hammer. Barkley immediately started nodding, his head jerking up and down like a broken puppet. "Yes, yes," he shrieked, his voice cracking. "We entered without permission, okay? Happy now?" I stopped recording. "Now, get out." Barkley paled even further, but he had no choice. He scrambled toward the exit on all fours, tripping over himself like a pathetic fish flopping on dry land. Somehow, he managed to stagger to his feet and bolt outside. A second later, the sound of a car door slamming shut rang through the air. Titan followed, slowly, methodically. He didn't growl, didn't bark, didn't lunge. He just walked, a shadow looming over them, silently delivering their sentence. I reached the garage entrance, arms crossed, watching them scramble like rats. Linda was already in the car, her wide, terrified eyes locked on me. Barkley collapsed into the driver's seat, slamming the door and gripping the wheel with trembling hands. The engine roared to life. A second later, they peeled out of my driveway, tires screeching against the asphalt. I watched them disappear down the street. Then I turned to Titan. He still stood at the garage entrance, unmoving, his gaze fixed in the direction of the fleeing vehicle. I grinned. "Well, buddy, looks like you just won this battle." Titan simply wagged his tail and let out a big, lazy yawn, as if the whole thing had been nothing more than a warm-up. But I knew. The war wasn't over yet. By sunrise the next morning, I was already at my computer, reviewing my security camera footage. The HOA thought they could break into my garage without consequences? Big mistake. I scrubbed through the footage, picking out the best moments. Barkley falling on his ass in sheer terror, Linda screaming like a trapped weasel, Titan looming over them like death itself. Then I got to work. 30 minutes later, the video was ready. HOA breaks into my garage and gets exactly what they deserve. I hit upload and leaned back in my chair. Now, all I had to do was wait. I didn't have to wait long. Within a few hours, the video exploded. The view count skyrocketed. Thousands of comments flooded in, all saying the same thing. "That Rottweiler is a legend. Absolute hero. HOA is basically a mafia, but without the honor or the code. Titan should send them an invoice for legal services." I smirked as I watched the public outrage completely obliterate the HOA's reputation. Then, the real fun began. 1 week later, the neighborhood's legal committee launched an official investigation. Turned out, Barkley and his HOA weren't just trying to steal my car. They had dozens of complaints from other homeowners, complaints they had buried. But this time, they couldn't cover it up. The video was too big. The public pressure was too intense. And then, the moment I'd been waiting for finally came. The HOA formally dropped all claims against me and was forced to pay me compensation for illegal trespassing. But the best part? Barkley resigned. That smug, power-hungry bastard, who thought he was untouchable, was now publicly disgraced, humiliated, and jobless. And when the official letter confirming the case closure landed in my mailbox, I put up a new sign in front of my garage. "Property protected by dog, and yes, he loves lawsuits." I hammered the last nail in, then stepped back to admire my work. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely at peace. That evening, I kicked back on my porch, stretching out as the sun dipped below the horizon. Titan lay by my feet, paws stretched out, his breathing slow and steady. I glanced down at him. "Looks like you just made this neighborhood a little safer, buddy." Titan let out a quiet rumble in response, then lazily flicked his eyes up at me before yawning like the whole thing had been just another Tuesday. I chuckled. The HOA got exactly what they deserved. And damn, it felt good.